Welcome to the 3 Life Lessons podcast, where I, Rob Hubbard, talk to renowned figures from learning and development to uncover the secrets to their success and find out what makes them tick. Remember to like, subscribe and follow to ensure that you never miss an episode. So I'm so delighted to have here with me today Nick Shackleton-Jones. So I think it's fair to say that if you're in L&D, you will probably know Nick's name. So Nick is not kind of making too big a thing of it. I think one of the leading thought leaders globally, and you always have an interesting perspective. You always kind of, often when we've had conversations in the past, there's stuff that you'll talk to me about that at the time I'll be kind of scratching my head a bit. And then weeks later, I'll go, that's what Nick was on about. Wow, that's really interesting. And I'll go and research it. And I think so many people have that same experience of what you share. I mean, you've also had a glittering career in senior leadership roles, in learning, in large corporates. However, I've never really thought of you as a sort of traditional corporate person, more of kind of a bit of a kind of swashbuckler. Really? So I think what you're doing now, which you'll tell the audience about shortly, feels like a much better fit to me, at least. So Nick Shackleton-Jones, welcome to 3 Life Lessons.
Thank you so much. I love that you graded me like on an aircraft from thought leader to leading thought leader. I was like, I feel like I got a bump there. And then you doubled down with the glittering, and I felt like I was standing there just, reveling in being a leading thought leader, and then you got one of those like guns where you shoot the glitter and you went poof.
That's
and I was
exactly
like,
it.
oh wow, I'm a glittering leading thought leader. So I think that's probably as good as it gets for me. But yes, what you asked me what I do. So go for it.
There'll also be an effect I'll put on video that will like, there'll be a shaft of light coming down from above to illuminate you, Nick. Possibly a halo. I might go halo, but let's see. But anyway, please tell us, what are you doing now, Nick, in terms of swashbuckling, and what was your route to get there, please?
Aside being a public nuisance on any social media I can get my hands on, I think the doing, that's always the interesting thing, isn't it? Is like trying to link your passion in your life. I know this is a kind of a Thai trope with what you actually do. The Japanese call it ikigai. So honestly, I've always been fascinated with how the universe works, how people work. I studied psychology and philosophy, for many years for that reason. And I think my work is sort of a way to monetize that passion, really. So the reason that I say slightly maverick, swashbuckling is good things, is because I'm always trying to kind of push on, and not everybody has that appetite. So I mean, I can be sort of literally annoying, within organizations or without. Constantly wanting to, wobble or poke the status quo, and actually encourage people to kind of think a bit deeper or go a bit further or do something a little bit different. That's what I do. And I mean, commercially, I'm making money out of that through Shackleton Consulting. I do a whole range of things, organizations wanting advice on their strategy. They might be sort of trying to build their learning culture or shift to a skills-based organization. I design and deliver executive development and leadership programs, do some culture change stuff, customer service, induction, do a lot of kind of induction design. And I quite like all aspects of it. I like the digital side as well as the face-to-face experience design side of things. But I always try and do things, and I promise I'll stop, from an audience-centric perspective, so that they actually deliver some kind of outcome. You'll recognize that as kind of performance consulting. Talk to people, find out what they're struggling with. And I always try and make things experiential for reasons that most people will know, which is that I think that learning comes from the emotional impact of an experience, and as a consequence, if people are just sort of sitting, watching the slides go by, no learning is happening. That's enough about me.
Yeah. Well, not quite enough, because you've got 3 life lessons to share with us, Nick. So let's move on to the first one. So what's the first life lesson that has helped kind of guide your journey over the years?
Well, as a young man, I was quite impressed. Well, I was impressed by lots of philosophers, but Socrates has this famous phrase, know thyself. And it sort of carries you quite a long way until I really sort of understood something from reading Nietzsche, which is laugh at yourself is actually better advice. Because the problem with knowing yourself is it will only take you so far. You can sort of learn about yourself, but there's a danger that you reach this point where you become this very self-serious kind of person, and at that point
Yeah.
you're fossilized. You stop growing. So if I'm talking to somebody and I sort of pick up that they're very self-serious, then I know it's not that they're a complete waste of time. You can still learn something from somebody like that, but they're like a book. They're fixed. And there's not a deep mystical reason for that. It's just that, especially as people get older, their ego gets attached to what they know or an area of
Yeah.
expertise. And at that
Yeah.
point, that effectively fossilizes them. You know, they just become fixed because there's so much emotional investment in a set of rituals or practices or thinking. So without that ability to kind of laugh at yourself, your knowing yourself will only take you so far. So the first advice I would say, yeah, and it's also a good personal test. You know, when I'm particularly stressed or fatigued, and I notice that I've just stopped being able to laugh at myself, then I think, oh, okay, that's not good.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be hard when you're under the cosh not to take things too seriously. But I mentioned this, when was it? In the last one that we did with Charles Jennings. You know, he had another one of his life lessons was don't take yourself too seriously.
Yeah.
You know, don't take your work too seriously either. You know, don't be like, you know, have fun with it. You know, enjoy it. And you know, I kind of link that back to when we are having fun and we are relaxed, we're more creative, we're better at solving problems, we're better at collaborating with others, and things just kind of flow a lot more. And I wish there was more of that, you know, in the kind of, it's interesting to think about how the workplace
Yeah.
has kind of changed over the years. And, you know, I've never known people in companies to be busier or more stressed with less predictability and more restructures and all of this kind of stuff. And it's even more important to elbow that space for fun, to laugh at yourself, to not take yourself too seriously.
It is. Absolutely loved Charles. And also, it's advice which is good in so many contexts. So, leaders, for example, you might be familiar with Google's Project Oxygen, where they found that the highest performing teams were ones where there was this kind of playful atmosphere. And the leader plays an important role in creating that by
Yeah.
puncturing, you know, that sort of anxiety that people have about how they're going to show up, by creating kind of psychological safety. And humour, humility and honesty, the 3 H's, I think go a long way. I was interviewing in BP in a very technical discipline, because this might sound like sort of soft and fluffy advice. One of the best turnaround leaders that BP had, and the turnaround is when you shut down a whole refinery and you bring it all back up again. Hugely risky, hugely complex. And I said, what's the most important thing when you're leading a turnaround? And he said, sense of humour. He said, I think sense of humour. He said, because things will go wrong, but you know, if you can have a laugh about it, you'll figure out a way to solve the problem. Whereas if people start pointing their fingers and, you know, blame gets shuffled around, it'll all go to hell. So
Yeah.
Laughing at yourself is good in lots of contexts for lots of reasons. But
Yeah.
personally, keeps me, I guess, growing and developing.
Yeah, fantastic. So what about life lesson number 2, Nick? What would you like to share?
Well, there's a quote from How People Learn, which is the book I wrote, now in its second edition, which is that life is measured in adventures, not years. And people seem to quite like that quote.
Yeah,
it's
that's
true
lovely.
poetically, and I think it's also true psychologically. And the reason for that, the kind of the bridge between the two, is, as some people might know, the affective context model, which I kind of put forward as a model of learning and cognition. And it basically says that the way that you encode your experience is via the emotional reactions that you have. So if your day is utterly boring, you'll find it forgettable. I mean, that's just common knowledge. You can test it experimentally, you know, but we tend to remember the things that have some kind of emotional impact on us. Now, there are people who like to think that memory at some level stores everything, but any decent neuroscientist will tell you that's not true. We're cognitive misers, we store fragments, memory is reconstructive, and so we're generally reconstructing from kind of emotional impact, things that impacted us. The practical consequence of that, though, is that you will shorten your life by living a boring routine life more than you will by alcohol or obesity or smoking. The thing that will really cut your life short is living every day exactly the same. So
Mm.
I think life, as I say, is measured in adventures. When I look back on my life, it's all the adventures I remember. I mean, we were talking about yours just as we kicked off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think always kind of push yourself to do the adventurous thing, I think would be
Mm.
another way to kind of put that. So I've tried to do
Yeah.
that, especially as I've got older, actually, because I find it's almost tougher as you get older. You start to crave just the couch and the routine and the predictability.
Yeah.
So yeah, keeps me learning. I mean,
Yeah.
there's also some science around that as well. That it staves off
Mm.
early dementia if
Mm.
you're challenging your brain in interesting ways to solve
Yeah.
new problems.
Yeah. Well, it's that use it or lose it thing, isn't it? I saw there was a television program I saw years ago about people in their 80s and 90s leading incredibly productive lives. Either, yeah, there was one guy in his 80s who was doing the Ironman competitions, doing the Escape from Alcatraz one. He's not coming in the top third, he's right towards the back of the pack, but he's still doing it. And he was saying, friends of his have got terrible knee problems and hip problems and arthritis, and he said, use it or lose it. And when you're having an adventure and you're stretching yourself, that's what you're doing. You're using your body, you're using your mind, you're using your creativity and your problem solving, and all of that keeps you. Anything that you demonstrate to your body, this is important to me and helpful to me, your body kind of rises to the challenge a lot of the time. So I think you're absolutely right. It does keep you young, keep you
I think
active.
use it or lose it it acts in reference to your life. I think
Mm.
using your life is about living adventurously, which perhaps is the link to the
Yeah.
swashbuckling. And I've done that so much more. But what's interesting is I think big organisations often use you in a very specific way
Mm.
that they will start to narrow. I was finding this in sort of more senior roles in organisations. They start to narrow
Mm.
your day until you're only really kind of running in a little circle and doing the
Yeah.
same sorts of things, attending meetings, saying similar things, writing similar emails. And I
Mm.
think you are being used. Your life is being consumed in quite a frightening
Yeah.
way. So yeah.
Yeah. Very good. I love that one. Yeah. I love doing adventurous things. I love being a little bit not crazily out of my, if that's my limit, I don't want to be kind of crazily beyond it, but just a little bit beyond it in whatever I do. I find that incredibly kind of energizing, basically. And when it does just become boring and you're just doing the same thing, it closes you down, doesn't it? It shuts you down. So life lesson number 3, then, Nick. What's this final one that you'd like to share with the audience?
I suppose it would be the value of difference. The value of difference. The value
Mm.
of difference is the name of a book by Bina Kandola. And we did some work on the D&I program, as it was then, back at BP with Bina Kandola, and it's a
Mm.
great book. But what I realised sort of increasingly as I've got older, as I've lived my life, is that it's much broader than diversity. If you talk to people about the
Mm.
value of difference, they sort of nod and say, "Oh yes, yes, well, very sensible," because they've
Yeah.
learned to acknowledge anything that relates to kind of diversity. But try presenting them, with a different idea, or try showing up
Mm.
differently in a business meeting and see,
Mm.
just how they kind of react to it. And I think
Yeah.
that what is the value of difference? Well, I think it's beyond creativity. It's about
Mm.
adaptability. So if you've got a
Yeah.
team, do you have lots of interesting people with different approaches and different thinking styles within that team?
Mm.
That's going to determine how far you can go, both as an individual and as an organisation. So
Mm.
I sort of hate the conventionality. I always see it as brittleness in a person or in
Yeah.
an organisation. And so, but what I found, and it's rather a shame, I think, really, is that almost everybody they will claim that they value difference, but they have an aversive reaction
Mm.
to people who think and operate and dress and look different. And
Mm.
to me, I think has become a kind of a lifelong battle. In
Mm.
my different organisations, some of which you know about, I've always tried to recruit people from very different backgrounds with very different perspectives
Yeah.
on things, and I've loved that. It's benefited me kind of hugely, and I've learned so much from it. And so I think that I'm constantly looking for difference, and it links into the adventure point, really. So how much difference can you
Mm.
tolerate? Because that's a measure of you as a person. There are people who seem superficially great. You know, Elon Musk, for
Mm.
example, superficially seems great, but he's actually quite a small person because his tolerance for
Mm.
difference is not that big. So I think it's the measure of the breadth of a person, you know, their openness to difference, I guess.
Yes. God Emperor Musk, as I like to think about him. I think that's what he's insisting on being called these days. But yeah, I mean, we know this, that, strength in diversity through nature. We have these. You go to woodlands these days, and it's just one kind of tree. That's all that you've got, and it's often the pine trees, and there's nothing. The forest floor is virtually dead. There's no light gets to it, and then a disease comes through, and it sweeps through the forest, and the whole forest dies. And in fact, what you want is a huge diversity of different species of trees and shrubs and plants, and then you get a really thriving ecosystem that's also, as well as being kind of rich in diversity, it's incredibly resilient as well. And I think that's a really fascinating model for really what businesses should be. There's the chap that wrote Rebel Thinking. I can't remember his name now, but he one of the chapters in that book is about how the CIA failed to predict 9/11 because all of the people were recruited from they're all white guys, white men of a certain age. They all went to a handful of top universities, and before that went to a handful of top schools, and they all thought the same way. There wasn't that diversity of thought. And his argument, which I think is absolutely correct, is you need those different perspectives. You need those different views on things to be able to consider the complex world that we live in, which seems absolutely spot on to
Yeah, I
me.
used to make a joke of it in consulting because I think consulting, because they pay good salaries, tend to hire the kind of the A grade students, the people who got a first, the school
Yeah.
prefects. And I used to make a bit of a joke of it and
Mm.
go around and point at people and say, "Were you a school prefect?" And it was remarkable the number of times that they would say yes. And I think it's
Yeah.
problematic, that whole system, because we tend to churn out people who are very anxious about doing what they're told. That's why they get the good grades.
Mm.
You know, they're so anxious that they study super hard.
Mm.
You know, they hand in all their work on time, and they're good people
Mm.
to hit deadlines. You know, they're kind of foot soldiers. You can tell them,
Yeah.
charge that position, and they don't care that they'll get machine gunned in the process. And
Mm.
in practical terms, what does that mean? Well, they they, they tend to burn out, but they lack that kind of autonomy and creativity that diversity brings. It's sort of beaten
Mm.
out of them. And Rory Sutherland says something similar about. I mean, it's slightly, the pressure is greater in marketing, which is his background. Why aren't we hiring the
Mm.
weirdos? And so I think there's been this sort of
Yeah.
toxic conspiracy, I think, between education and business to turn out kind of cookie cutter people,
Mm.
to the detriment of difference and tolerance for difference, which
Yeah.
yeah, which is a great shame.
Yeah. It is indeed. Well, I mean, thank you so much, Nick, for being with me here today and sharing three fabulous life lessons with us, which I couldn't have predicted them, but they I can see they fit you so well. And like looking at your career and what I've known of what you've done and the ways that you've worked, I used to love it when I'd ask you how work was going, and you kind of give me an estimate in terms of numbers of days or weeks until you thought you were going to get sacked, and that was kind of a measure of your success. Like the kind of shorter that was, the more feathers you were ruffling, and the more kind of diversity of thought and diversity of approach you were bringing there. So, Nick
We used to joke
Shackleton-Jones,
over
thank you
lunch
so much.
when we were at BP, just before we sign off, about compiling a list of ways we could get sacked, and we would come up with these weird and wonderful exploits and adventures, some of which we would do. And I would just sort of mentally add them to the list of ways that you could get sacked. But somebody once said to me, anything worth doing is worth handing your badge in for. And
Hmm.
in corporate life, I think that's probably true. But that's
Yeah.
precisely for the reasons that we kind of outlined, is that there's often a low tolerance for stepping outside of the lines, for colouring outside of the
Yeah.
lines. So, yeah. Anyway, it's been good to see you again. And thanks
Yeah.
for putting me
Always,
on that
always great to
podcast.
catch up. You're very welcome,
Thanks,
Nick.
Rob.
Thanks for being a guest. If you've enjoyed learning those 3 life lessons, then make sure that you like, subscribe and follow so that you never miss an episode.